Hi students, it was suggested that I add some support for this article, so what I want to do is read it to you and offer some commentary to help you understand it. Just the background for a second. Most of your history courses will have taught you that World War II ended the Great Depression because the government began spending a lot of money and unemployment virtually disappeared. Now today, a lot of historians disagree with that view, and I wanted you to be able to hear it and then evaluate it. So in this article, Tom Woods gives some evidence that seems to suggest that World War II did not have the benefits claimed by some economists, and in fact, wars in general don't really help the economy. So here's what he says. Whenever an earthquake or a tornado causes great damage, some recorder somewhere claims that on net it will boost the local economy since the rebuilding effort will create jobs and increase business for local merchants. Similarly, whenever a war breaks out, the same reporter can be counted on to emphasize the economic stimulus it allegedly conferred. So stimulus means a boost in spending, right? So they're saying that whenever a war breaks out, that's going to be good for the economy because now we're spending more money. As if on cue, in May, the Washington Post published an article headlined, "Across America, War Means Jobs." Although it acknowledged that the matter wasn't quite so simple, the article nevertheless quoted a great many people who asserted that war was a boon for the economy, meaning that war is good for the economy. If it wasn't for Defense Department contracting, said Brian Smith of Columbia Sewing Company, we would not be here, and 200 people would be out of a job. Roanoke Mayor Betty Slay Ziegler was thrilled. These people have grown up sewing in textile plants, and there are so few now. They were desperate to have jobs, and it's going to expand again. I'm so grateful. The economy is always helped by war, appliance salesman Gary Gayer told the Post. That's just a fact. So as you'll see in a second, this is often called the broken window fallacy. And on its surface, it does seem that war helps some people, because it does help some people. But the question is, who does it hurt? And what are we not seeing? That's what's being left out of the equation, so to speak. So he continues here. It is clear that war stimulates or boosts certain sectors of the economy, but it is logically and economically unjustified to equate that stimulus with prosperity for the American people as a whole. So just because it helps some doesn't mean it helps all people. Ludwig von Mises summed up the correct position when he observed, war prosperity is like the prosperity that an earthquake brings, or a plague brings. Frederick Bastiat exposed the broken window fallacy in the mid-19th century. A shop window broken by a man's incorrigible son, incorrigible meaning like a bad son, is said to benefit the economy since the company that fixes the window enjoys a stimulus, which in turn is passed along to those with whom the window company does business. What this analysis overlooks is that the man with the broken window would have spent his money on other things if he had not needed to buy new glass. The stimulus that would have been bestowed on, say, the picture frame store, where he could have spent his money, now never occurs because he's had to replace his window. Had the window not been broken, the shopkeeper would have had a window and a frame. Now he only has a window. So on its surface, the broken window does seem good for the economy because it helps some people get new jobs. But what is not seen is the people who would have gotten the business had the window not been broken. And on net, the economy is worse off because the man now has to replace a window. And instead of having a window and a picture frame, he still only has a window. So the repair of the window is what is seen. And focusing on it leads poor logicians, or people with poor logic, to conclude that the breakage was actually a boon. The lack of a picture frame is not seen, but is no less a consequence of the unfortunate incident. The same kind of analysis can be fruitfully applied to war. The jobs created for the production of weapons and other military equipment, as well as the jobs in the armed forces, are paid for by taxing the private economy. Thus, financing wartime activities diminishes private incomes, that is, the ability of Americans to buy the goods they need. And because people and capital goods are now producing war-related items and services, fewer are available to produce goods for consumer needs. In short, Americans have less money with which to buy fewer goods. How can this be anything other than economic retrogression? Meaning, how is society better off because people have fewer things that they can use? Wealth isn't just the amount of money you have. Wealth is more about the amount of stuff you have, the products you have. And in wartime, much of the production is shifted to making tanks and guns and bullets, and not refrigerators, cars, or clothing, or cell phones, or etc. So there are countless other deleterious or negative effects as well. In extreme cases, government rations certain crucial goods to ensure adequate supplies for the military. Rations means that you can't buy as much as you want. You're given coupons, and there are limits to how much you can have. So during World War II, there were meat rations and clothing rations, and you took these little coupons to the store to get whatever the government deemed you were allowed to have. So no definition of prosperity includes restricting the civilian population's ability to acquire goods or to buy goods. But even when outright rationing is not undertaken, government purchases nevertheless distort the economy. For example, large purchases of steel will lead to price increases, making it more difficult for private businesses that use steel to meet their competition in the global market. Meaning that if the government's buying a lot of steel, it's harder for car companies to buy steel to make cars, right? So the price of cars will go up, all things equal. If the higher prices attract new steel producers, this new production comes at the cost of abandoning other industries, thus further skewing the economy in favor of the government's preferences over those of the consumer. Some will object that the military equipment is fundamentally different from other goods that the government might buy, since it is necessary to protect the population against foreign enemies. But even if we assume this to be true, it is still the case that war itself does not create prosperity. Buried in the Post article was the amazing statistic that in real terms, the cost of the Iraq War will surpass, or will grow greater than, the American share of World War I. To put it mildly, that is a substantial drain on the private economy. So how does this relate to World War II, right, which is the purpose of the lesson?
How are you?
So here's what Tom Wood says about that. Part of the reason that the prosperity through war myth persists is that most people have been taught that World War II lifted the U.S. out of the Great Depression and ushered in a period of unprecedented affluence. But the myth is no more valid for that conflict than any other. Historians make much of the substantial production and employment statistics compiled during World War II and triumphantly point out its great economic stimulus. But most of this increase was due to the construction of armaments and military equipment and payments to military personnel. This production was not geared toward producing things that ordinary people needed. From a purely economic point of view, the war made consumers worse off by diverting capital and other resources away from civilian production, production of cars and clothes and other things, and toward the production of goods that no consumer would wish to purchase. Between 1943 and 45, some 2/5 of the people who could work, including members of the armed forces, civilian employees of the armed forces, people who worked in the military supply industries, and the unemployed, were not producing consumer goods or capital goods geared toward the production of consumer goods. That was not all, of course. The tax money from the remaining 3/5 went to fund military production and activities. All of this amounted to a dramatic loss of material wealth. Basically, what this paragraph is saying is that when the government started ramping up production, it wasn't to produce things that the average consumer wanted. It was to produce war supplies, and that the average consumer was actually worse off because production of what we want went way down. Unemployment did virtually disappear, but it did so primarily because 11 million people were added to the armed forces, mostly by conscription, meaning they didn't have a choice. They were drafted into the military and forced to serve their country. Whereas normally we want that to be a voluntary decision, right? These people were forced. As Robert Higgs explained, during the war, the government pulled the equivalent of 22% of the pre-war labor force into the armed forces. And voila, the unemployment rate dropped to a very low level. No one needs a macroeconomic model to understand this event. In fact, this is one of the reasons why you start to see a massive influx of women into the workforce. Because so many men were drafted, they needed a lot of workers. And so you had a lot of retired people and women join the workforce to help staff the factories producing all the war equipment. In the unhampered market, jobs are never in short supply, since human wants are unlimited. More labor is always needed to produce more goods. The sick economy of the New Deal, however, could address the unemployment problem only by conscripting, or drafting, over a fifth of the labor force into the military. That's over 20%. Meanwhile, the average work week in manufacturing increased by 7 hours between 1940 and 1944, and by a full 50% in bituminous coal mining. And because of the demands of wartime, people found it more difficult, and sometimes even impossible, to acquire the goods they needed. No one could buy a new car, house, or major appliance, since the government had forbidden their production entirely. A great many other goods were either unavailable or difficult to obtain, from chocolate bars and sugar to meat, gasoline, and rubber tires. As economist George Reisman writes in Capitalism, people believed they were prosperous in World War II because they were piling up large amounts of unspendable income in the form of paper money and government bonds. They confused this accumulation of paper assets with real wealth. Incredibly, most economic statisticians and historians make the same error when they measure the standard of living of World War II by the largely unspendable national income of the period. Common sense is right, after all. Death and destruction do not lead to prosperity. That should be obvious. But as George Orwell once said, we have now sunk to a depth at which restatement of the obvious is the first duty of intelligent men. Alright, so I've read you the article, so now go ahead and start looking at the questions to see if you understand it. But if I were to summarize this piece, Tom Woods is trying to argue that on paper, the war did make the economy look better off. But these effects are somewhat misleading because the average person didn't really improve. The standard of living of the average person didn't improve. The government was spending all that new money on the war effort, not on producing cars or appliances or clothes, right? The private sector wasn't producing those things. And so the average person, while they had a job, right, wasn't really better off until the war ended. That's when the true prosperity began. All right. So go ahead. You're going to have to write a summary and answer a few questions, okay? I hope this helped.